This World War II letter to a soldier is marked missing in action, return to sender, verified by War Department. And the recipient of this letter, Sergeant John Sinodin, actually spent 3 years in Japanese POW camps after he was captured in the Philippines. But the story that this letter tells is as much a story about his mother as it is about John himself. And the letter itself is dated the same day as the postmark, January 19th of 1942. And the very first paragraph talks all about how this mother has not heard from her son since December 6th and is worried sick about him. And that date of December 6th, 1941 is very important. You see, in July of 1941, the US had deployed 20,000 troops to the Philippines to augment the 100,000 Filipino troops that were already under US control because the Philippines was a US possession in 1941. But on December 7th, the next day after she'd heard from her son, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and the following day, December 8th, they actually invaded the Philippines. And Mrs. Sinodin had no way to know this, but the place that the Japanese had invaded the Philippines was at Clark Field, which is exactly where this letter was addressed to. And it's obvious that more than a month later, she still didn't know that her son was missing in action, because not only did she send that letter, she also, out of an act of desperation, sent him a stamped envelope that included blank pieces of paper, assuming that maybe the reason he hadn't written her was that he didn't have the proper supplies. And this desperate mother had to be absolutely crushed when she received this envelope back, marked MIA, showing that her son had gone missing on the field of battle. But that's not even the sad part of this story, because I also have this letter from Mrs. Sinodin that was postmarked March 30th, 1942, where she is still begging for news from her son, which means that almost 4 months after it actually happened, she still had no idea that he was missing from the field of battle. And she tells him once again how worried she is about him, as well as the fact that she's writing him every single Monday, meaning that there were at least a dozen letters that at this point had gone unanswered while she had no idea the whereabouts of her son. And even the address tells you how terrified she was, because as opposed to being addressed to the Philippines, this one is actually addressed to Australia, because General Douglas MacArthur had recently retreated to Australia and on March 18th was starting to make headlines across the country declaring that he was going to return and take back the Philippines. So, not only had she not heard from her son, she had also found out that the general in charge of the army had retreated to a completely different continent. And in her desperation, she even addresses it, care of General Douglas MacArthur, right at the bottom, knowing that he was attached to a unit that was commanded by MacArthur when she saw those headlines back in the States. So for at least 4 months, this poor mom went out of her head with worry, having no idea where her son was, and would remain that way throughout the war, because we now know that Sergeant John Sinodin was interred in a POW camp operated by the Japanese and was not released until the end of the hostilities in 1945. And when he was released, he was awarded the POW medal upon his return to the United States. These letters are a grim reminder of the incredible price that the families of our service members pay and how war truly affects our entire society.